Hey everybody, Mr. Duker back again with another video, this time on the Civil War, super simplified. Now there's a lot of Civil War content on the internet that's way better than this. This is not a comprehensive look at the Civil War. The Civil War is huge and complex and multifaceted and multi-layered. This is just kind of a very quick simplification of some of the bigger points, some of the main ideas that will usually show up in your history classes. Again, not really getting into much details, just a kind of brief, quick overview of the entire war from beginning to end, cutting out a lot of stuff I know, but again, if you want a quick overview of events, this is the place to be. So on my previous video, I had done one on events leading up to the Civil War, and it ended pretty much with Abraham Lincoln's election. Lincoln's election is what kind of forms the Confederacy. It's that election that you start to see Southern states start to leave. No slaves have been taken away. No laws have been passed. It's just a simple presidential election that kind of starts the Civil War or gets that ball rolling. So Lincoln is elected in the election of 1860. Lincoln did not get a single vote from any Southern state, and now he is their president. The Southern states basically say, I didn't vote for this man. Nobody I know voted for this man. This man does not represent me. They're afraid that Lincoln might radicalize the North, that he might start coming after the slaves. This is no longer a representative government, and we leave, which the South thought they had every right to do. So this has kind of been hinted at in years prior, the South threatening to leave, but here they finally do it. South Carolina is the first, and soon after, many other states will leave, forming what's called the Confederate States of America. What's interesting is you also have a lot of states in the middle between the North and the South, and these become what are called border states. We often forget these, but these are pro-slavery states that are part of the North, and that's why they're called border states. They're on the border between North and South. So here's a pretty good map kind of showing the differences here. And as you can see, the border states in the middle with those little lines are in between the two sides. If they could, they would join the South, right? Because they're pro-slavery. But the North basically marches soldiers into them early on, occupies these states, and forces them to stay in the Union. They could leave the South if they had the chance, but the North is hanging on to them through military control. So against their will, they're part of the Union. Keep in mind, California and Oregon, way over on the West Coast, are still part of the Union. You have a lot of territories still. The country is still growing at this time. And so the United States, the map might look a little different, well, look a lot different than today, but this is the country when the war started and the two sides. What actually kind of begins the conflict, the shooting, starts at the Battle of Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter was a little island fortress in South Carolina. When the Southern states start to leave, it's occupied by pro-Union, pro-Northern forces, and they are instantly surrounded by hostile forces, by hostile enemy. They're in another country, according to the South. These guys are trapped, and they need to be rescued. So what does Lincoln do? Lincoln's got choices. Again, no one's really shooting yet. Tensions are high, but these men have to be rescued, or Lincoln just leaves them alone, and they kind of become prisoners of war. Not a good way to deal with this conflict if you will, appear weak or look to kind of give in to the South. So Lincoln has a choice. What does he do? If he sends a rescue mission to rescue these guys, he could risk war, and he would look like the aggressor. He's invading the South to rescue these guys. Instead, Lincoln comes up with a compromise, something he's pretty good at. He sends supplies into the men at Fort Sumter, right? Kind of like the Berlin airlift. It's kind of what this was after World War II. I will send supplies. It's not a hostile act. I'm not provoking war. I come in peace, just so these men can survive and kind of hang out inside their fortress, because supplies, of course, would be running low, and they really can't go knock on the neighbor's door to go borrow some sugar, right? And basically puts the ball in the South's court, right? So what do you do now? If you attack these men, if you try and take the fort by force, you started this war and not me. First blood is on your hands. And he baits the South, and they respond by attacking Fort Sumter, officially starting the Civil War. Shots fired April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter is attacked. The bloodiest war in American history begins with the casualty of a single horse. That's the only person who dies in Fort Sumter. There's some trivia for you. So now we are at war, and Lincoln has to try and win this war. He could, and many people in the North will get to this, wanted the South, just let them go. We don't even like them, and we don't want to deal with slavery. But Lincoln, no, right? You cannot just leave the country because you didn't get your way. You can't just leave because you don't like the way things are going. That's not how democracy works. Stick with it and deal with it. So Lincoln chooses to basically wage war to, again, occupy and force and demand and pull the South back into the Union to keep the United States into one piece. So he will wage war to save the Union. He will kill Americans to save the Union. That is the choice he's making. That's a heavy choice. How is he going to do it? Both sides, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, expected the war to be over very quickly, as most people usually do. Wrongly, of course. So Lincoln calls up for 75,000 men to serve for only 3 months. By 3 months, the war is over. You can go home. Your job is done. You've served, and you've done your bit of patriotism. The Union plan has 3 parts. So the North's plan comes the Anaconda Plan, as we'll see, but 3 parts to this plan. Number 1, the North planned to blockade southern ports. The North has most of the ships. They still control most of the Navy, so very easy just to block off southern shipping ports, kind of wall them off from the rest of the world, and kind of put them in quarantine, economic quarantine, to starve them of supplies and medicine and weapons and money and all sorts of stuff. 2, capture the Mississippi River. The South does not have many railroads, as we'll see. The Mississippi was kind of like the big highway that goes through. And if you could capture Mississippi, not only do you take away their main kind of source of transportation, you split the Confederacy into 2, divide and conquer. Be much, much easier. And then kind of wait. The whole plan was just to strangle the Confederacy, and eventually they would quit and surrender. That was the idea, once pressure has been put onto them, right? So cut them off economically, cut them in 2, and then just like a constrictor snake, an anaconda snake, here we go, famous cartoon, just kind of squeeze them until they suffocate, just like an anaconda does. It's a constrictor, and they should quit, and the war will be over. Problem was, they realized this could take a long time, and if the war goes long, that would be good for the South, bad for the North, and people in the North might give up. They might grow tired of this, and you only got an army for 3 months. You really can't play the long game. So this plan changes a little bit, and Lincoln knows he needs to try and end the war quickly. He really can't afford to wait. So the Anaconda Plan is mostly kept intact. Part 3 changes, though. Instead of waiting, as we'll see, drive into the South, capture the capital, and try and occupy them. Now, the Confederacy, their plan is a little different, right? They also want a short war, and they need a short war. The North has, as we'll see, more men, more weapons, more money, more factories, more of almost everything, except for cotton and slaves. And so if the war goes long, the North could just overwhelm the South, and they will end up losing if it goes long. However, if it does go long, the South kind of has a contingency plan. There's a chance they could just bore the North. Does that make sense? Get them to grow tired of the war, make the war too costly, and the North might just give up. This was basically very similar to the strategy of the Continental Army in the American Revolution. This is what Washington was trying to do. He knew he really couldn't beat England on the battlefield, but if they could survive long enough, if the colonies could stay in revolt and forever, England might just get tired of fighting and give up, and you get your independence that way, right? Kind of by the other side just going back home. Also, so that's what the South was kind of doing. The South also kind of viewed this as the Second American Revolution, getting rid of another tyranny like Lincoln instead of King George. But sorry, super simplified. We're not getting into details, right? Another backup plan, like a second plan B, is this idea of cotton diplomacy. Basically, the South has a lot of cotton. That's what they're good at doing. And countries like England, their economy was dependent on Southern cotton at the time to use in English factories to make their economy work. Without Southern cotton, because of the North blockade, English factories are going to go out of business. People are going to be unemployed. Their economy goes into a tailspin. And maybe England would join the war on the South side. Not war for oil, like we think of today. War for cotton. That was the idea. England, though, had abolished slavery long ago. Slavery is apprehensible. England does not like slavery. Very small was the chance that England would actually support an ally with slave-welding states. But it is an idea that the South hopes England could bail them out because they do have a big navy. They do have a big army. Again, kind of like the Revolution and trying to get allies in France and Spain, but it doesn't quite happen. Sorry. Strengths and weaknesses, okay? The North, like I said, they have a lot of strengths, as we mentioned. A lot of factories for weapons. Lots of railroads, which will be key in this war. New technology, never really been used in warfare before. Super important during the Civil War. They already have an established government, right? So we kind of take that for granted, but they already have a president and a constitution and a Congress and all that stuff. So the South doesn't, and they got to make a new government on the fly. The North already has a strong, working, functioning government, which is pretty important, and a diversified economy, a strong economy. Lots of people like immigrants coming, lots of different things. They're very strong economically. They have a lot of wealth, basically. But they do have weaknesses. As I kind of hinted at before, not everybody in the North thought the South was worth fighting for. Best to just let them go. And so even throughout the entire war, we forget, but Lincoln was kind of unpopular, even among Northerners. And the North is very divided on this war, and if it's just and worthwhile. It's going along with that, people in the North also have different views on slavery. There's still lots of racists in the North, right? And it's not all slave and all anti-slave. It's a mixed bag. And so again, a lot of people maybe didn't like slavery, but maybe it wasn't worth fighting for. Maybe it's not worth sacrificing my family for, right? Like I said, they want the South to go. And another problem is the North is fighting a war of invasion, right? To win this war, they need to go and occupy all the southern states. They're very big. They're very spread out, and basically control and take over all of them individually, which is not easy to do. What about the South? They do have some strengths. The South has a pretty good core of military officers. Now, in the Civil War, a lot of these generals and officers ended up going to the same school in the years before. They were friends, they were classmates, but for whatever reason, when everyone had to choose a side, the South just seems to have gotten the better of these generals, like Robert E. Lee and General Longstreet and others. They're pretty good when it comes to that. The South is fighting a defensive war. They're fighting on their own home turf. They're not trying to invade the North, though they will. They're just trying to hang on and protect their home. So that's a very different type of a war that you're fighting. The South had gotten a head start in the years before by training militia in drilling their soldiers. So they kind of have a head start there. Again, the Southern soldier has a little more training than those in the North. Because the South is more rural, it was a lot more common for Southern boys to go out and live in the wilderness and to go out and hunt and know how to clean and use a gun and stuff like that. And they're fighting for a unified cause. The North is divided, as we saw, but almost everybody in the South, will exclude the slaves, wanted independence, wanted their freedom, wanted the North to leave them alone. And again, they're all fighting basically to protect their homes. So that is a strength. But they do have a lot of weaknesses. Very little railroads. They had a little bit, but not nearly as much as the North. So it's hard for the South to move. The South is just slow because they have to walk everywhere, right? They're building their government on the fly, and their government isn't great, as we'll see. They have no real allies. They have no diplomatic relationships, very few factories, so they really can't make their own weapons or guns. A lot of the time the South will have to steal from the North. And this new government they're building is a confederacy. It's a weak type of government. It's one the United States had in the beginning before the Constitution, and we had to throw it away because it didn't end up working. The South is really kind of 13 separate nations is how their government was built. They're allied together. They're unified because the North is invading them. But each state kind of saw itself as its own country. And so each southern state kind of had its own plan to win the war. Each one had its own army. Each one was kind of doing its own thing. They often didn't talk to one another. They didn't share supplies with one another. They are very fractured politically, the South. All right, let's get to the war again. So the first big major battle, and the one we always kind of start with, is called the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. Most Civil War battles have two names, so it's easy to get them confused. In the North, they usually name them after rivers or creeks where the battlefield was. And in the South, they usually name these after towns nearby the battlefield. So depending on your point of view, I'm just going to say Bull Run. Here, the North, after training their soldiers, is marching to Richmond, trying to capture it. Richmond and Washington, D.C. are fairly close to one another. You could walk there, which the North does. And 30,000 troops against 20,000 Confederates. When the battle began, each side is green. This is the first real taste of combat for most of these men. And there's a lot of wavering, but over time, the Union does seem to get the advantage and start to push and kind of rout the Confederates as they start to fall back and falter. However, this is where a guy named General Stonewall Jackson becomes famous, Confederate general, who basically kind of holds his ground, rallies his troops around him. He's like standing in the middle of this hill. There's bullets and fire going all over him. And he rallies his men to kind of stop retreating, stay by me. I think the nickname is there. There was Jackson, someone said, standing strong as a stone wall, right? And so the South kind of gets a second wind, and they're able to hold on long enough for trains. I know I said the South didn't have a lot of railroad, a little irony here, but actually the South is saved by trains at this time. They were fighting next to a southern railroad, and they were able to get a lot of soldiers on a train, steam them straight up to the battlefield. These guys literally just jumped off the train into battle, and that turned the tide, and it gave the victory to the South. This is pretty big deal. It's the first time a train's been used in combat before. These men, usually the North, had to walk the entire way to the battlefield. So they're tired, they're exhausted, their feet are sore, their backs are sore. They're not fighting at 100%. But if you could just ride a train to combat, these guys are fresh, well rested, good to go. And so they're a little more combat effective, right? Now it's the North who is getting routed, and they are running back home, dropping their guns, every man for themselves. They called it the Great Skedaddle. And even civilians had come to watch this. There were people with picnic baskets on the edges of battle watching it. Hey, honey, what are you doing today? You want to go see a battle? Sure, let's go take the kids. People did this. So there were spectators watching this. And when the Northern soldiers had to run back home, they ran into the civilians and they got caught up in this huge retreat as well. So a huge mess. It's just, war is messy, especially in this case. And it's a Southern victory. They stopped the North from taking Richmond, and there are casualties on both sides. 387 Confederate, 460 Union. When this was in the newspaper, people were aghast. Oh my gosh, look at all of these men who have been killed. This is terrible. Drop in the bucket compared to what will be happening later on, where you have thousands of men getting killed, not by the day, sometimes by the hour. This is the bloodiest war in American history. It just takes a while to get there. Bull Run also proves this will be a very long war. It will not be short, and it's kind of practice for both sides. It shows how hard each side was willing to fight and sacrifice to try and get their way. Oh, there we go. Same information again. There you go. Like I said, it's a warm-up. Again, any idea of a short, quick, easy war gone, as usually happens in war. Few wars are quick and few wars are easy. So when they realized it wasn't going to be long battle, we start to see other battles, or a long war. When it wasn't going to be a short war, we start to see other battles in the future, and the casualty counts start to skyrocket, which we'll get into in a minute. There's a rematch at Bull Run, 21,000 casualties there. The 7 Days Campaign is, again, the North again trying to invade Richmond. Over about a week, you see the casualties there. Shiloh at the time was the bloodiest battle in American history. With 23, almost 24,000 American casualties at that battle. It's Americans killing Americans, which is why, on top of reasons we'll see, the death count is so high here, because we're taking losses on both sides. But why so many deaths? Why is this the bloodiest war in American history? There's a few reasons for this. One of it is the generals, right? So as I mentioned, the leaders on both sides went to the same school, took the same classes, got taught the same tactics and strategy. And before the Civil War, everybody was basically trained in what was called Napoleonic warfare, made famous by Napoleon in Europe in the years before. This style of warfare was based mostly on bayonets, right? Even though the men had cannons and the men had guns, the main goal was basically just the guns were used to march your men close enough to the enemy where you could kill them hand to hand. The guns were slow, the guns were inaccurate, and so most of the fighting was still up close and personal with those long, sharp daggers on the end of your gun. It's called a bayonet, like a pike. The whole point, like I said, was to march in close, and the guns might buy you time to get close, but most fighting was still done, like I said, hand to hand. That didn't apply anymore because war had changed. Technology had changed. New invention called the mini ball, you can see a little picture of it there, revolutionized tactics, and in the Civil War they were a little slow to figure out how much things had changed. The mini ball is named after a French inventor, I think Georges Manet was his name, and you can see it kind of looks like a modern bullet. Before this, bullets were just little solid lead balls, but the mini ball is pointed, and it's kind of like, you ever see one of those Nerf footballs, right? It's like a football, right? So it's a little more aerodynamic, but in the middle, it's hollow. And if you can see, it's got some little grooves on the edge of the bullet. So it's smaller than the diameter of the barrel. So these bullets will just fall straight into the gun. But when you fire, the gas goes into that hollow part and it expands the bullet just enough for those grooves to catch the rifling in the barrel. So now the bullet actually fits nice and snug. The rifling puts a spin, just like a football, on the bullet. And now these bullets fly far and straight and accurately where before they never could. Is an example there with muskets, which they used in the Revolution and during Napoleonic warfare. The best you could do with a musket ball and a musket was about 100 yards. Very, very inaccurate and not that big of a distance. Even 100 yards, you weren't guaranteed to hit what you aimed at. As a matter of fact, these old muskets didn't even have sights on them because the guns were so inaccurate, there was no reason to aim. You just pointed in the direction of your enemy and hope you hit something. Rifling existed, but the mini ball, it didn't really work well until the mini ball came around. They were very slow to reload, right? The mini ball changes that. And now, again, these rifles could go almost to 9 football fields in length, right? So imagine you're fighting a war. You think you're fighting muskets, but your opponent has rifles. You're charging your men into the enemy to try and get close and stab them with bayonets. Usually you would only be in that real danger zone if in the last 100 yards. So you'll take some casualties, but enough men will get through. You can start stabbing and fighting people, right? Now in the Civil War, those men are taking fire the entire way in. And by the time you crossed 9 football fields, 900 yards, very few men were either left alive or in any shape to start stabbing people. But this is what they did in the Civil War. Time and again, generals on both sides would send men over and over and over to charge into men holding rifles. And these guys got picked apart, never came close. They figured it out, but it takes a little while. And what you get is this. These are photographs from the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. And this was a bloodbath, and these you can just see the result of rifle fire. These men laying on the side of the fence, all in rows, shot where they were aligned, and it was bloody, bloody stuff, the Civil War. Going back up to Lincoln in the North. So Lincoln's got some issues. Like I said, there's a little bit of division in the North. And so we're in the middle of a war. This is a national emergency. I have some special powers. Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. This shows up in all your history classes. Habeas corpus basically is if you are arrested, you have the right to be accused of a crime. You can't be arrested for no reason. Lincoln says, screw that, right? If you're a Southern supporter, that makes you dangerous. I can't be trusting you, and so I will throw you in jail just because of your political beliefs and allegiances. Didn't commit any crime, didn't really do anything wrong. You're just thinking the wrong way, or you have different beliefs, dangerous beliefs. So he starts throwing people in jail, suspends habeas corpus. I can jail you for no reason now. That happened in the North. Many people in the North, like I said, supported the Democrats, supported the South. Democrats in the North largely supported the Southern states, and these people were called copperheads because, like the snake, they were dangerous. They were snakes in the grass. Again, they can't be trusted. And a lot of these people thrown in jail without habeas corpus were these copperheads, these people living in the North but kind of politically loyal to the South. And no surprise, Lincoln gets a lot of flack. He's very much disliked for this. Not to mention, this war is going long, casualties are mounting, and he gets a lot of blame for this. His election, start of the war, he's choosing to wage war to bring the South back, and very, very unpopular during this time, especially in the South, but even in the North. Lincoln was not as liked as we remember him to be today. The South has its other issues as well. Like I mentioned, the South is a confederacy. They're more like individual countries with just they're allied together because the North is attacking them. But they have kind of the opposite problem of Lincoln, is that everyone's doing their own thing. There's really no strong central authority in the Southern Confederacy. They had a president. It's this guy here. His name is Jefferson Davis. But he had very little powers to actually do anything. During the war, he was always complaining, I wish I had the powers of Abraham Lincoln so I could actually tell these states what to do and organize and get everyone on the same page. But he could basically ask the Southern states to fight and behave in certain ways, but he was often ignored, and he was kind of powerless to get any cohesiveness together. That's what a confederacy is designed to be like, and that's what the South was. Now, Lincoln, like I said, is struggling to end this war, even though the North has more men, more weapons, more factories, more trains, more ships, more of everything. They still really struggle to take the South out. They have almost every advantage. On paper, this should not be much of a contest. But one reason the North struggles is they have a really hard time, like I said, finding good generals. Specifically, Lincoln gets stuck to one guy named George B. McClellan. You can see him right there in this tent. McClellan is young. He's an up-and-coming guy in the military. Since no one really has much experience, he's kind of as good as anybody, and he does a good job of training those soldiers before the Battle of Bull Run. He's very good at discipline and drilling men, but really not good at leading them into battle. And McClellan is very, very passive. He's very, very defensive. He always seems to have an excuse why the North shouldn't attack and use its overwhelming advantage to crush the South. And early in the war, Lincoln becomes very frustrated with this general who has this giant army, well equipped, well supplied, but just kind of refuses to use it and kind of, drags the war out unnecessarily, gives the South more time to prepare and get ready. A lot of friction between these two, and more friction to come. The Battle of Antietam, a very important battle in American history, Civil War history, the bloodiest day in American history, apologies. Basically, to try and end the war quickly, because that's what the South wanted, Robert E. Lee decided, the Southern general, takes matters into his own hands and decides to invade the North. If they won't do it, I will do it to try and end the war quickly. And so that was the plan, the South invading the North to try and give the North a huge military defeat and maybe bring them to the bargaining table and end this war. McClellan had to come out and stop this now. You really can't make an excuse or run away from this huge Southern invasion. McClellan, luckily enough, even finds Lee's battle plans, like the day before the battle. Someone found them left behind, wrapped in some cigars, if I remember correctly. So McClellan even knew exactly what Lee's plans were for battle the next day. But the Battle of Antietam is kind of a draw. McClellan was forced to fight. He had Lee's battle plans, but even then, he really couldn't get a decisive victory because he's constantly refusing to commit men to battle. He's slow to react to things. And like I said, it is the bloodiest day in American history, even to this day. 23,000 Americans dead and wounded in one day of combat. The invasion does fail. Lee takes a lot of casualties. He can't keep invading with how many losses he had. However, had McClellan been aggressive and chased Lee after this first day, Lee was pretty badly beat up. There's a good chance McClellan could have overtaken him, could have defeated him, and the war could have ended at Antietam because Lee kind of put himself in a dangerous spot. But McClellan didn't take advantage of this. Like I said, he comes up with excuses not to attack. And after this, Lincoln becomes upset, fires him. I think it's not the first time he fires him either, but he gets fired for kind of being incompetent and not really taking advantage of all the advantages he had in this battle. There's a picture of the bridge from Antietam. I think there were 3 separate battles at Antietam. The bridge was one of them, and there's the men trying to cross the bridge. I think it took the North 3 or 4 tries to cross that one little bridge, but they kept getting pushed back each time. Anyway, Antietam is important for not only the bloodiest day in American history, not only because the North could have won the war, but it does profoundly change the war as well. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln decides, well, that's good enough. That's a victory. I'll take it, right? It wasn't decisive, but we stopped them from invading. That's a win in my book. And he issues what's called the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Very, very famous. Lincoln's kind of executive order to free the slaves. This is huge, okay? Because you got to remember, the Civil War didn't really start over slavery. It started over an election. It started over what the South said was their right to leave, right? No slave was ever taken away at the beginning of the war. It was an ugly war. over land and states' rights. Who wants to die on the battlefield for states' rights, right? It is ugly. It's a war of conquest. It's a damn dirty civil war. Emancipation Proclamation changes all of this, right? Now it's no longer about a land grab. This is a war about freeing people. It's a war of liberation, right? Go back and think of some of the more well-remembered wars in American history. They're always wars of freeing others, bringing liberty to those who never had it. American Revolution, we're fighting to free ourselves, right? World War II, we're fighting to free Europe. We're fighting to stop the Holocaust. We're fighting to save the Pacific, okay? We're helping people who can't help themselves. Civil War is in the same boat, right? Now the war has changed, and the North is waging war now to free people who have been bonded in chains their entire life. This is huge, and it changes the entire reason the war is being fought for in the first place. Very, very important. However, there's a catch-22. There always is, right? As much as we like to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, in reality, it ended up freeing 0 slaves. The way it was written, it only freed slaves in states of rebellion, which basically means the fine print said that the border states, right, the ones in between, their slaves could still be kept because they weren't rebelling. They were still controlled. So it's a little hypocritical that some of the states in the North that already had slaves, they could keep them, but those of you that were causing trouble down south, those slaves are now going to be free. So a little uneven message here. And even though it was ordered, the people in the South had no reason to follow this. Lincoln wasn't their president. He wasn't part of their country, so they just ignored it. So really no slave was freed because of this immediately. But again, it will change the war, and going forward now we will be freeing them. But the war didn't start this way. The war started ugly. It had to metamorphosize. It had to change. It had to go through metamorphosis to become something greater and better than what it was. And it took Antietam to do that. Lincoln, let me go back, had actually written the Emancipation months ago. He had already decided he was going to free the slaves. It had gotten to this point. There's all this bloodshed already. This is if nothing good comes of this, what a waste this war would be. So he already decided to free the slaves, but he wanted to issue the Emancipation from a point of strength. Before this Antietam, the North was kind of losing the war. Every battle that was fought, they weren't doing very well. And to issue the Emancipation when they're losing the war would end up, he knew, looking desperate. It would look like he was grasping at straws. Something he could do to prop up support, to try and change people's opinions of things, and Lincoln refused. He just sat on this and waited and waited and waited for a position of strength before a victory so he could issue that, and it would have more teeth. It would carry more weight. We would remember the Emancipation probably a little differently if he issued it after some huge losses. So, jumping forward here, now we have a little bit later the Battle of Gettysburg. Antietam's the bloodiest battle in American history. Day, but Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle because it's a 3-day fight. So again, the North is going through the Anaconda Plan, and by July 1863, they're pretty close to capturing the Mississippi. As a matter of fact, there's only one town left on the Mississippi River. They haven't taken over, the little town of Vicksburg. And Vicksburg is holding out as long as they can. They're surrounded. General Grant is there, shelling them every day, but they refuse to surrender because they know if they do, the North will have cut the Confederacy in half. Robert E. Lee, Southern general, has to do something to save Vicksburg because it would be a disaster for the North to take control of Mississippi. Lee's pretty smart, kind of a good general, so he goes in a different direction, right? I will save Vicksburg is his plan, not by marching to Vicksburg and rescuing those men. No, I will save Vicksburg by invading the North. right? I'm going to put the emphasis up there. I'm going to put the North in trouble. And so those guys attacking Vicksburg are going to have to leave and go and rescue the North. I'm going to go threaten Washington or something like that. So he's doing a little bit of diversion, right? If I can invade the North, change the focus of battle, they'll have to leave Vicksburg alone, is his thought, and come chase me. That's how I can save Vicksburg. So pretty good idea. And he marches into, again, the South invades the North. And here he makes it all the way into Pennsylvania. And it just so happens that these two armies, Northern and Southern armies, happen to bump into each other at this small little farming town. No really big deal, called Gettysburg. Little fun fact, the South was, I think, looking for shoes. That's why they were there in the first place. Stealing shoes is how this battle began. But very quickly, once they bump into each other, both sides kind of realize that, this is going to be a major engagement. Lee had brought all of his men with him. And when the North finds Lee's men, they knew he was there. They were looking for him. When they find the main part of Lee's army, it's a red alert. They're calling in all their forces from the area to converge on Gettysburg to try and stop these guys as well. 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg. The first day is kind of just a feeling out of each other, calling in reinforcements. No huge amounts of fighting yet, but one important thing happens, as you can see on the map. On the first day, the North ends up capturing the high ground. So they don't actually capture Gettysburg. There is a hill outside the town that gives the North, if you control it, a commanding, overlooking view of the entire countryside so they could see what the South was doing. So the North takes the high ground. You think of Gettysburg as kind of a giant battle of King of the Hill, right? They've taken that on the first day. On the second day, the South is trying to assault the hill, trying to find weak points, trying to get around the hill so they could capture it and take it. They came close at the bottom. There's a place called the Little Round Top. There was an undefended sector of the northern hill that was kind of left alone. The South found that and was almost able to rush troops through this gap into the hill and take it out. But the North was able to rush men just in the nick of time to stop them. And it's one of the few times you actually had a successful bayonet charge in the Civil War. But the North holds them off. And then on the third day, famously, we have what's called Pickett's charge. Both sides had taken a lot of losses during the previous 2 days of fighting. Lee knew his men were exhausted, but he expected that General Meade, the general in the North at this time, his men were just as bloodied and tired as well. And he was convinced one final push in the right spot could dislodge the North from the hill and give him the victory he wanted. And so we get what's called Pickett's charge. You can see it. It's the middle arrow right here. There we go. Basically, he sends his men, as we mentioned before, kind of charging across open ground against men armed with rifles and cannons up a hill to their defensive positions in hopes they could overrun them and then fight hand to hand to take these guys out. Everybody thought this was a terrible idea, except for General Lee. He was convinced his men could do it. But if you look at all the arrows and the different ways the Confederacy tried to attack on this map, the path took by Pickett was among the greatest distances to travel. It was open countryside, very little cover. There was even some picket fences, that's where they get their name from, that the men had to stop and climb over to get up there. And they were being shot at the entire way. So nobody tells General Lee no, even though they thought it was a bad idea. General Pickett and his men make the charge, and to everyone but Lee's surprise, it's a disaster. Most of the men never even make it close. They never finish the charge, and the few men who did make it up the hill into the Union lines were too exhausted, were too shot up, too outnumbered to really do anything of importance, and those men had to then end up run all the way back across that farm field back to their defensive lines. The charge is a failure. Lee takes heavy losses during the charge for no gain at all, and that was basically it. He didn't have the strength after Pickett's charge to keep fighting and ends up retreating the next day in defeat. The South will never again invade the North during the Civil War. There you can see a photograph of what Gettysburg looks like today from the position of a Northern gunner, shooting at men from Pickett's charge. Again, not a lot of places to hide, not a lot of places to run, and those men were just cut down in droves trying to make that charge from what it looks like today. Today, Gettysburg is, of course, a historic national park. But Gettysburg is important because it is the turning point of the Civil War. After this, the South will never invade again because they're not strong enough. They lost a lot of men. It's going to take time to kind of retrain and regroup and come back from a huge defeat like this. The South doesn't have very many men in the first place. The North lost a lot of men as well, but not to be callous, they are replaceable. The North has manpower. They can just keep putting more men in uniform and won't ever run out. So the North can still keep fighting from a position of strength. But from this point on, the South is just kind of hanging on as long as they can because it's such a huge, devastating loss for them. Afterwards, we get, of course, the Gettysburg Address. This should probably be its own video, and it might be. But shortly afterwards, people realized that this was an important battle. This battle meant something. And even before the dust had settled, people knew something monumentous happened here at Gettysburg. And so they create a huge national cemetery there for the men who lost their lives. And Abraham Lincoln was invited to come and give a speech to kind of open up and dedicate this giant war memorial for the men who lost their lives at Gettysburg. The story goes that Lincoln comes out. He writes the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on a train. Doesn't really have a lot of time to work on it. It doesn't really think it's a great speech. This is it right here on the screen. As you can see, it's very, very small and not his best, again, work, he thought, but it's the best he had at the time. And so this is his speech during the address. That morning of the opening ceremonies, tons of people came out, as you can see from this photograph, to honor these men and be there for this occasion. Lincoln was the last to speak that day. I think there was a guy before who spoke for like an hour or two, which I'm probably getting close on. I'm giving that guy a run for his money. But he spoke for a long time about the war and the battle and what's going on, and no one really remembers what he says or remember who he is. Lincoln came up to give his speech afterwards, and Lincoln's speech is over in like less than 3 minutes. And this is the only photograph we have of Abraham Lincoln giving his speech at the Gettysburg Address. It was so short, it was so quick. Even the photographer at there that day wasn't prepared. He wasn't ready. And basically Lincoln is stepping off the stage. Oh crap, he's done. I got to hurry and snap a photo quickly. And so here you can see there is Lincoln in the middle, not wearing his top hat. But the speech is over and he goes back to sit down and again doesn't think it's a really great speech. How wrong he is, because in just 3 short paragraphs, a very short speech, he was able to very elegantly rephrase and kind of rededicate and give a big morale boost to the war and the cause and why we're fighting, and that these men shouldn't die in vain, and they're fighting for democracy, and they're fighting to free the Southerner slaves. And people talk about the speech a lot. It's very deserved. Sometimes less is more, and the Gettysburg Address is a perfect example of saying a lot with just a little bit. I should probably take notice, correct? All right, let's try and wrap this up. So, can't speak about Civil War, of course, without talking about African Americans who fought in the war. So when the war began, blacks were not allowed to fight. This was a white man's war. This didn't involve them. Even though they wanted to, because there were free blacks in the North, they were turned away. You might be able to do other jobs like cooks or janitorial work or supply work, but you weren't really allowed to fight or anything. Emancipation Proclamation changes that. The fact that the North took a lot of casualties changes that, and we could probably use every able man now that we could. And so blacks were allowed to fight from 1863 onward, and fought incredibly bravely, right? Again, this is a war now about freeing the slaves, and there were huge amounts of blacks who were dying for the opportunity, right, to free their families, to free their people. For legit, you may have families still in the South who wasn't able to escape, right, to prove their bravery, to prove their patriotism, and blacks fought with great skill and determination and ferocity and went above and beyond what they were asked for. On top of that, no surprise, the country's still quite racist. They were not treated very well. They were given less pay than white soldiers. They were often given more, janitorial duties or cleanup duties, like demeaning kind of duty, busy work duties. Looked down on by a lot of white soldiers as not being able to fight as well. And keep in mind, if you were a black soldier and captured by the Confederates, you sometimes faced a punishment worse than death. They would be tortured, they would be executed, or they would be captured and put into slavery. The South did not look kindly, of course, and so if you were a black soldier and captured by the Confederates, you did not have a good chance of making it out alive. They did not take prisoners, and sometimes they were put back into slavery. Despite that, they still answered the call. They still fought for their country. They still fought for their people, and they fought extremely bravely. 1864. It's funny how this happens. Presidential elections usually pop up in the most inopportune times, and it had been 4 years since Lincoln's election, and we're due for another one. And we have what's called, we have the election of 1864, just as important as the election of 1860. 4 years of fighting, huge numbers of casualties. The war isn't any closer to being done today than it was before. People in the North still very divided. A lot of people were against the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not, again, super supported by everybody in the North. Lincoln is unpopular, and his advisors were afraid if this election continues in the time of a civil war, there's a good chance he might lose the election. He might be voted out of office. Somebody else might come in who might try and negotiate a peace with the South, and that's exactly what happened. George B. McClellan, that general at the Case of the Slows, the guy that he fired after Antietam, ends up coming back for revenge, to run against Abraham Lincoln as a Democrat in the North during the Civil War. And he basically ran on a platform as the next general of the army, as a leader of men. I want to bring the troops home. I want to end the war. If you vote for me as president, I will negotiate a peace with the South. They will have their own way, and our boys will come home, and I will save them, and I will end this horrible, bloody war if you elect me president. That is a very positive message to a lot of people in the North, and it looked like McClellan might win. Lincoln was actually asked to postpone the election, to cancel it, or wait until the war is over. But Lincoln, to his credit, said, we're fighting to preserve the Union. We're fighting to preserve the United States. And what a hypocrite I would be if I cancel an election because it might be detrimental to me. No, the election will continue. It's actually the very first election to take place in time of a civil war. But even though if I lose, it's not worth canceling it if we lose our way. So the election will continue. Lincoln, though, is bailed out. On the eve of the election, the North actually gets a major victory. A guy named General Sherman, we'll come back to him in a second, ends up capturing Atlanta, which was one of the few industrial center or cities in the South. They didn't have a lot of big factories, but Atlanta was one of those industrial hubs. He captures Atlanta. And when that is done, a lot of people in the North can finally see some light at the end of the tunnel. The war might be over soon if Atlanta is captured, and it happened right before the election. And so that's kind of a big, again, morale boost. We've come this far. It would be such a shame to just quit and let the South off the hook. I guess you could say. So Lincoln ends up winning a second term off the victory at Atlanta. So now that Lincoln is elected to finish the job, now that the South is on the ropes, they're fighting a defensive war, they're running out of men, Atlanta has been captured, the Mississippi has been captured, it's time to finish the fight. So Lincoln puts a new general in charge. He goes through a lot of generals during the war, but finally he found someone, he says, who understands the math, a guy named General Grant. Grant will become president of the United States in the future, but he's one of the few generals who really, Northern generals, who really kind of understands what the Civil War is all about and how to win it. According to Grant, it's very, very simple. The North has more men. The North has more weapons. All we need to do is lean on the South over and over and over, and we will whittle them down, we will wear them out, and take away their ability to fight as long as we don't give them any breaks. We got the men, we just need to use them. And so that's basically Grant's strategy. He's very blunt, but once he's in charge, he is relentlessly attacking the South again and again and again and wearing them down. And each time the South retreats, he's gaining a little more Confederate territory. He's killing a little more Confederate soldiers, and their army is getting smaller and smaller and smaller each time. He loses a lot of men. These are very bloody battles. But Grant, again, understands the North can afford it. And so he starts to apply pressure, which nobody really had done until that point. On top of that, one of his best friends is General Sherman, the guy who took Atlanta. And together they come up with a plan to end this war. So Grant's going to take the main force of the American army, and he's just going to go after Lee and start hammering towards Virginia to capture the Confederate capital. In the meantime, Sherman and his troops, instead of attacking military targets, he's got a different idea. I'm going to end the war quickly by bringing the war home to your average Confederate person, your average civilian. He goes off in a different direction. He just marches through from Atlanta through South Carolina to the sea, not towards any military target, but basically he's just going on this giant rampaging path of destruction, right? Total war is what we call this in the history books, but basically destroying the South's ability to wage, but also to support a war, right? So for example, every town he comes across burns it to the ground. Every farm he finds, he torches it. Every piece of railroad track, and there's not many, he will tear it up and twist it so the South can't use those railroads, right? Any food, they won't be able to eat it. Any homes, they won't find any shelter because I'm destroying everything I can. I want to be clear. He's not killing people. He's not executing them. He's not a Nazi, but he is making them homeless. He's taking away their food. He's making them miserable, and he said he had every right to do so. War, Sherman says famously, is hell. War is all hell. I'm bringing that hell to the South. You wanted to leave. You wanted to keep slaves. You brought this upon yourself. So I'm going to let you feel like what the men in the battlefield feel. Cold, hungry, homeless, and starving. Destroys everything in his way. This is called Sherman's March to the Sea. And as you can see, he did what he said, right? These are some photographs of some railroad track he twisted up so they couldn't rebuild it. Every home he found, he burned to the ground, so only the brick chimneys were there. And according to Sherman's men at the time, this was the best time they ever had. Imagine you're 18, 19 years old, you're in the army, and your commander basically just tells you, go have fun and destroy everything you can. It's arson and vandalism on a huge scale. And so his men will do that. You know, they're robbing, they're taking things they find. His men never ate better. They would just, they find a cow, slaughter that cow, cook up that beef, eat what you can, throw away the rest, right? So the South couldn't eat it. So they ate well. They weren't in combat. They're having fun destroying things. They had a pretty good time. But again, he's bringing that war is hell. He's bringing that home to the Southerners and making them scream for mercy. His whole idea was to make war so give them such a bitter taste, right? Let them remember how terrible the war is, that the South will never ever think again within 100 years of like leaving and causing any more trouble, right? He's punishing them for what they did. And this works, right? With Sherman destroying everything in his path and Grant relentlessly marching towards Virginia. Lee does his best. Every day his army is shrinking, and eventually he realizes he just can't keep fighting anymore. There's no point in losing these more men and dying for a lost cause. The war is over. Lee's smart. He can read the writing on the wall. And finally, he asks for surrender. So famously, the Civil War ends in what we call Appomattox Courthouse. This is just the name of a building between the two sides. And the Civil War ends April 9th, 1865. So Lee sent word that he would like to surrender, and Grant said he would accept it. Lee came, I think, in his like best uniform, nice and clean and pressed and ready to go. He came early, or he came on time, and Lee's kind of, we think of him as kind of like Southern gentleman and very appropriate and kind of old school. Grant was a little late. He had some duties to do before. His uniform was dirty and muddy because he just wanted to get there quickly. And so kind of compare and contrast these two different generals. They made some small talk. I think Grant actually served with Lee in the Mexican-American War, where Lee had command. Lee doesn't remember him. And then finally they get down to brass tacks and start talking about surrender. Now, Lincoln had actually already talked to Grant about this occasion and had come up with a plan, so Grant already knew what these surrender terms would be. And on Lincoln's orders, they're very, very generous, right? Basically, Lincoln told Grant to tell Lee that if he surrendered, as long as his men laid down their arms, dropped their weapons, every Confederate soldier was free to go back home, right? You're not a prisoner of war. You're not going to be put under arrest. You're not going to get tried for treason. Go home. Go to your families, right? Go and see your mom and your dad or your kids or your wife. Go home to the farm. They need you. They miss you there, right? Go home as long as you promise to stop fighting. That's a sweet deal for the Confederates, and most of them had already left and gone home anyways. But Lee will accept these very gracious terms, and so that's how the Civil War ends. Again, Lincoln is trying to heal. He's trying to bring the country back together, and he doesn't want to be vindicative. He doesn't want to have a lot of regret or bitterness, and so we're going to have to live with these people. Let's try and, as best we can, I don't want to say no hard feelings, but let's just try and put this behind us and try to kind of heal. That's kind of Lincoln's mentality. And so the war ends, again, in Appomattox Courthouse. Whew. Now, when the war is done, as I told you, it is the bloodiest war in American history. About 365 Union soldiers dead, 290 Confederate soldiers dead, all Americans. So that is quite a lot. Wars are expensive. The Civil War is no different. $3.5 billion is what was spent to fight this war. And when the war is over, the South, for all intents and purposes, is gutted and destroyed in almost every single way imaginable. Physically, yes, their cities and farms are all burned, destroyed to the ground. There's no food because all the men were off fighting, so nothing has been planted for crops, right? Family of people, the death toll is huge. Their economy is in shambles. Their society has been torn apart. The slaves are free. This working class that they've been oppressing forever are now equals in running and walking among them. And what does that look like? And how are you going to handle that? And the South has just been, like I said, absolutely devastated by this war. The North was invaded a few times, but really most of the fighting took place in the South, and it was the South that really bore the brunt of this war. But now that the war is over, there's still some questions that need to be answered. And that's what Reconstruction is in this next chapter of American history. But those seeds of Reconstruction are already kind of being planted here when the war is over. For example, now that the slaves are freed, how is the United States going to incorporate nearly 4 million people who have no education, no jobs, no home, no savings, no business? How do we bring them into the fold, more or less, when they really have like nothing in their name, nothing in their... What do we do to bring these freemen, they call them, into our society? How do we bring the southern states back into the Union? They left, right? They didn't want to be part of us anymore. They had their own governments. Treason is punishable by death. This is a major thing. How do we bring them back? Just forget everything that happened? Nearly impossible with how long the war went and how bloody it was. They got to come back somehow. But how much do we forgive, and then how much do we punish them? And then also, how do you do anything when Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated just within days of the war ending, and probably the one man who had a plan, and the one man who people would have listened to, and the one man who probably could have brought the country back together is taken away from us, and now no one really knows what the plan is. How do you do any of this when Abraham Lincoln doesn't survive the war itself? That's Reconstruction. That's a whole nother set of videos. This went super long. Like I said, this is not supposed to be comprehensive, but the war, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff we missed. If you're interested, Civil War, it's fascinating. Tons of stuff on the internet. Go check it out for sure. But again, I hope this was helpful with just kind of the basics, the main ideas, and how they connect, and kind of how the war played out. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. And whew, that was a long video. All right, Mr. Duker, I'll catch you later. Bye.